year 1883, on May 26, in the industrial city of Mülheim am Rhein near Cologne, Germany, a child was born who would one day become one of the most infamous serial killers in European history. His name was Peter Kürten, later remembered with a chilling title, the Vampire of Düsseldorf. At first glance, his arrival in the world was unremarkable. He was the eldest son in a large working-class family, but his childhood was anything but ordinary. The family lived in grinding poverty, squeezed into a cramped apartment, and the atmosphere inside the home was one of violence, neglect, and constant fear. His father, a violent alcoholic, ruled the house with an iron fist. He frequently beat his children, and perhaps even worse, he subjected Peter's mother to relentless physical and sexual abuse, acts often carried out in full view of the children. For a young boy, these experiences left deep scars. The seeds of trauma were planted early. Growing up in such a hostile environment, Peter was deprived of affection, stability, and security. Instead, he learned that violence was power, cruelty was control, and suffering was an unavoidable part of daily life. For many children, such circumstances might break them or push them toward resilience. But for Peter, they twisted his developing mind in dark and destructive ways. By the age of 5, he had already shown troubling behavior. He was not like other children who played games of innocence. Peter displayed cruelty to animals, drowning small pets, torturing stray dogs, and watching their suffering with fascination rather than remorse. This pattern, often recognized by psychologists as part of the MacDonald triad of early warning signs for violent psychopaths, suggested that something inside him had already begun to warp. As he grew older, Peter's sense of alienation from other children became stronger. He rarely formed friendships, and when he did, they often revolved around darker activities. Around the age of 9, he befriended a local dog catcher's apprentice. This boy introduced him to acts of sadism against animals, a kind of secret game where the torture of creatures became entertainment. For young Peter, these experiences were more than just cruel play. They ignited an association between violence, death, and arousal, a dangerous combination that would define his later crimes. School offered no refuge. Though intelligent and capable, Peter quickly fell behind in his studies. The chaos at home and his lack of discipline prevented him from excelling academically. Teachers noted his disruptive behavior, and his peers kept their distance. He was an outsider, a boy shaped by trauma and already leaning toward darkness. By the age of 12, he had already run away from home several times. Each escape was short-lived, but each one also revealed his desperation to flee the abusive household. Yet, paradoxically, whenever he returned, he seemed to grow colder, more detached, and less capable of empathy. Around this time, his criminal tendencies began to surface more openly. He stole food, money, and small items to survive during his escapes. Theft was, in his mind, a natural extension of the brutality he had witnessed at home, taking what one wanted without consideration for others. One particularly disturbing memory from his youth highlights the development of his violent fantasies. While still a child, Peter reportedly attempted to drown 2 playmates in the Rhine River. Though they survived, the attempt revealed his early capacity to harm not just animals, but humans as well. Even at this young age, Peter seemed to derive a thrill from seeing others suffer, a chilling foreshadowing of the horrors he would later unleash on Dusseldorf. The influence of his father cannot be overstated. In 1894, when Peter was about 11, his father was imprisoned for sexually abusing Peter's sister. This event, while shocking, was hardly surprising to those who had witnessed the man's cruelty. For Peter, the arrest may have brought temporary relief from daily abuse, but it also reinforced a grim lesson that authority figures could be as corrupt and violent as anyone else. Trust in others, already fragile, deteriorated further. Despite the abuse, Peter's mother remained a complicated figure in his life. At times, she tried to shield her children, but her own suffering and lack of power rendered her protection limited. For Peter, this instability bred confusion. The person meant to nurture and defend him was also powerless to stop the violence around him. In his developing psyche, the concepts of love, pain, and power became hopelessly entangled. By the mid-1890s, as Peter entered adolescence, the trajectory of his life seemed set. Instead of moving toward normal teenage experiences, he was already entrenched in theft, violence, and fantasies of domination. His childhood, marked by poverty, brutality, and neglect, had shaped him into someone who no longer viewed human suffering the way most people did. To him, pain was not something to avoid. It was something to inflict, something to savor, something that gave him an unusual sense of control. Looking back at this period, criminologists and psychologists often point to Peter Kürten's early years as the root of his later monstrosity. The abuse he endured, the cruelty he practiced, and the lack of positive influences combined into a perfect storm of psychological damage. Though not every child who suffers trauma becomes a killer, in Peter's case, the combination of genetic predisposition, environment, and personal choice set him on a path of darkness. By the time he turned 12 in 1895, Peter Kürten was already a boy shaped by violence. He was not yet the infamous Vampire of Düsseldorf, but the foundation of that terrifying identity had been laid. The troubled child from Mylheim was growing into an adolescent whose fascination with cruelty would soon evolve into crimes far more disturbing. The world had no idea what was coming. By the time Peter Kürten entered his teenage years, the foundations of his twisted psyche were already firmly in place. The trauma and violence of his early childhood had begun to manifest in increasingly alarming ways, and the boundaries between right and wrong, pleasure and pain, had blurred in his young mind. Between 1895 and 1899, Peter would take the first irreversible steps toward a life defined by cruelty, violence, and criminality. At 12, Peter was no longer simply a troubled child. He was a calculated observer of human and animal suffering. He still attended school intermittently, though the lessons were of little interest to him. Instead, he spent his time wandering the streets of Cologne and Dusseldorf, observing people, studying their routines, and experimenting with small acts of theft and mischief. Pickpocketing and petty theft became his first ventures into criminal activity, but these were merely the surface layer of a deeper, darker impulse, an early fascination with dominance and control over others. Even as a boy, Peter was drawn to violence in ways that were far from innocent. He developed a disturbing hobby of torturing animals in secret. Stray dogs, cats, and birds became his unwilling subjects, and he found satisfaction in their suffering. While most children learn empathy and remorse, Peter's sense of morality had been warped. The more he inflicted pain, the more he seemed to enjoy it. This behavior did not go unnoticed by those around him. Neighbors recalled seeing the young boy with injured animals or witnessing him laughing while others cried. These early acts of cruelty would later be recognized by psychologists as significant warning signs of a developing sadistic personality. But Peter's fascination with cruelty was not limited to animals. By the age of 13, he began to experiment with humans in ways that were subtle but chilling. He would sneak into gardens or abandoned houses to scare children or threaten passersby. Though these attacks were minor compared to what he would commit as an adult, they marked the first steps in his progression from fantasy to action. He was testing the boundaries of fear and power, learning how to manipulate and intimidate others for his own amusement. During this period, Peter also developed an unhealthy obsession with blood. Accounts from later investigations revealed that he would sometimes cut himself or others in minor ways to observe the flow of blood, fascinated by its color, its movement, and the power it symbolized. To Peter, blood was more than a biological fluid. It represented life, control, and the ultimate form of domination over another being. This early fixation would later earn him the notorious nickname, the Vampire of Düsseldorf. School and family offered little intervention. Teachers were exasperated by his disruptive behavior. But the larger social system lacked the resources or awareness to address the root of his issues. At home, the violence of his father continued to dominate, and the absence of nurturing guidance meant Peter had no outlet for learning empathy or moral responsibility. By 1896, it was clear that the boy was moving along a trajectory toward increasingly serious criminal behavior. Around the age of 14, Peter's crimes escalated. He began to commit burglaries, breaking into homes to steal food, money, and valuables. But even these acts were often accompanied by sadistic behavior, leaving objects destroyed, animals harmed, or residents frightened. His actions were not merely opportunistic. They were a demonstration of control and dominance, an early rehearsal for the terror he would later inflict on adult victims. In addition to theft and intimidation, Peter engaged in sexualized acts of violence. Historical records suggest that he began experimenting with sexual impulses intertwined with aggression during this period. Although no serious sexual crimes were yet documented, his behavior, ranging from indecent exposure to minor assaults, revealed the dangerous merging of sexual arousal and sadism. It was a pattern that would later become a hallmark of his adult crimes. Peter's adolescence was also marked by episodes of arson. He was drawn to fire in a way that mirrored his fascination with blood and death, a destructive force he could control. Small fires were set in barns, vacant homes, and streets, and the young boy reportedly observed the panic and chaos he created with a sense of perverse delight. To Peter, the suffering of others was not incidental, it was the reward of his actions. Social relationships were nearly non-existent. Peter's peers, sensing his unpredictable and cruel tendencies, largely avoided him. He formed no lasting friendships and appeared increasingly isolated. Yet this isolation did not temper his impulses, it intensified them. Alone with his thoughts and fantasies, Peter honed his imagination of violence, planning scenarios in which he could exert absolute power over his victims. He fantasized about murder, imagining the fear in their eyes, the thrill of domination, and the intoxicating flow of blood. These were not fleeting thoughts, but rehearsals in his mind, preparing him for the horrors he would later commit in reality. By the end of the 1890s, Peter Kürten had already become a dangerous adolescent. At just 16, he had a record of petty theft, animal cruelty, intimidation, and minor assaults. But more ominously, he had begun to explore the psychological dimensions of fear and pain. He understood that terror could be manipulated, and that human suffering could be a source of excitement and control. These formative teenage years had transformed him from a troubled child into a young person whose fantasies and early criminal acts foreshadowed the depravity to come. What made Peter particularly frightening was not just the acts themselves, but his emerging cold calculation. Unlike many adolescents whose transgressions are impulsive or experimental, Peter displayed a growing capacity for planning and forethought. He learned how to hide his actions, avoid detection, and experiment with boundaries. He was becoming adept at living a double life, presenting a normal facade to the world while secretly indulging in fantasies of pain, domination, and control. In retrospect, the teenage years of Peter Kürten reveal a chilling pattern: trauma, isolation, cruelty, and early criminality intertwined to produce a young man on a path toward unspeakable violence. By 1899, the foundations of his identity as the future vampire of Dusseldorf were firmly in place. He had learned the intoxicating power of fear, the thrill of blood, and the control that comes from inflicting suffering. The boy who had once wandered the streets of Cologne, terrorizing animals and small children, was now poised to evolve into one of Germany's most notorious killers. The world had yet to witness the horrors that Peter Kürten would unleash, but the seeds planted in his teenage years ensured that the coming decades would be defined by terror, blood, and the infamy of a man who embraced darkness as both identity and obsession. As the dawn of the 20th century approached, Peter Kürten had moved beyond the turbulent impulses of adolescence and into a dangerous young adulthood. By the year 1900, at the age of 17, the boy, who had once terrorized animals and neighborhood children, was becoming a man who would now experiment with more calculated and serious criminal acts. The foundations of his future as the Vampire of Düsseldorf were solidifying, and the dark fantasies that had consumed his youth were beginning to manifest in reality. In these years, Peter's crimes grew bolder. No longer limited to minor theft or petty vandalism, he began committing robberies, often targeting small shops, homes, and unsuspecting individuals. His motivation was not purely financial. While money was certainly useful, these early adult crimes were also exercises in power and control. He derived an undeniable thrill from confronting victims, seeing fear in their eyes, and testing the boundaries of what he could get away with. Unlike ordinary criminals, whose primary aim might be profit, Peter's crimes were increasingly about the psychological domination of others. His fascination with violence intensified. Stories from local authorities and later psychological analyses reveal that during these years, Peter experimented with methods of attack that ranged from physical assault to strangulation. He began carrying knives and other weapons, practicing attacks in secluded areas to refine his technique. Though he had not yet committed the full-scale murders that would define his legacy, these early assaults represented a critical escalation. Peter was learning not just to instill fear, but to imagine himself capable of killing. During this period, Peter's personal life was turbulent. His relationships were fleeting and marked by secrecy. He was known to engage in sexualized acts of aggression, though documentation is sparse for this early period. What is clear is that he increasingly intertwined sexual desire with the infliction of pain, a dangerous fusion that would later define his signature crimes. He also developed a growing detachment from societal norms. Peter no longer felt bound by morality. He understood only his impulses and the ways in which he could manipulate others for his own gratification. In addition to assaults and theft, Peter experimented with fire in more deliberate ways. Arson became a recurring theme in his criminal behavior. He set fires in barns, abandoned homes, and streets, observing the panic and chaos he created. Fire, much like blood, offered a visceral thrill, an element of destruction he could control and from which he could derive satisfaction. For Peter, these acts were a rehearsal for terror. He was learning how fear could be weaponized, how chaos could amplify the power he felt over others. Peter's criminal activity did not go unnoticed by law enforcement. Local police began to keep records of his misdemeanors and arrests, though in many cases he escaped serious punishment due to the legal and social structures of the time. In 1901, he was briefly imprisoned for theft, a short stint that seemed only to harden his resolve. Prison did not rehabilitate him. It offered lessons in the mechanics of confinement, control, and survival. He learned how to manipulate authorities, how to lie convincingly, and how to maintain a calm, almost ordinary exterior while hiding dark desires inside. By 1903, Peter was becoming increasingly brazen. He escalated from minor robberies and assaults to more violent attacks against strangers. There were instances of knife assaults, beatings, and attempted murders, though at this stage they were sporadic and often impulsive. Yet even these early attacks showed remarkable cunning. He carefully observed his victims, waited for isolated moments, and ensured minimal risk of immediate capture. His early crimes were the rehearsal stage for a lifetime of meticulously planned violence. One particularly chilling aspect of this period was Peter's growing obsession with blood. He carried out small-scale experiments, cutting himself or animals, or inflicting minor wounds on victims, to observe reactions and sensations. Blood was no longer merely a biological substance. It had become a symbol of control, a source of excitement, and a bridge between his fantasies and reality. His fascination would ultimately lead to the acts that earned him the moniker Vampire of Düsseldorf. Peter also began to develop a dual identity during these years. Outwardly, he appeared as an ordinary young man, capable of blending into society without attracting suspicion. He held casual jobs, interacted with neighbors, and even participated in local social life. Yet beneath this facade, he nurtured his violent urges in secrecy, planning, experimenting, and fantasizing. This ability to live a double life, a seemingly normal exterior masking an increasingly monstrous interior, would become one of his most dangerous traits. The late 1900s brought further escalation. In addition to assaults and robberies, Peter displayed early signs of sexual sadism. While detailed records are limited, psychological evaluations and later confessions suggest that he began associating sexual arousal with dominance, pain, and fear. These early sexualized fantasies were intertwined with the thrill of violence, foreshadowing the pattern that would characterize his adult crimes: murder, sexual gratification, and blood. By 1909, Peter Kürten had emerged from adolescence into a young man with an established criminal repertoire. His crimes now included theft, assault, arson, and sexualized aggression. Yet more importantly, he had cultivated the psychological tools that would make him terrifyingly effective. The ability to manipulate, the understanding of fear, and the obsession with control and domination. He had transitioned from a troubled teen into a young adult whose fantasies and actions were increasingly aligned, setting the stage for the first confirmed murders that would soon follow. The trajectory of Peter's life during these years demonstrates a chilling truth about criminal development. Early childhood trauma, unchecked sadistic impulses, and a lack of societal intervention converged to produce a young man whose imagination and reality were intertwined with violence. By the end of the decade, Peter Kürten was no longer a boy testing boundaries or committing small misdeeds. He was a young adult, increasingly confident in his capacity for terror, preparing, whether consciously or subconsciously, for the reign of violence that would make him infamous across Germany. In hindsight, it is clear that the seeds of his infamy were sown during these young adult years. While the world remained unaware of the darkness lurking in Dusseldorf, Peter was already rehearsing, experimenting, and refining the skills, obsessions, and methods that would soon define him. The Vampire of Düsseldorf was not yet fully unleashed, but the foundation was complete. a man shaped by cruelty, fascinated by blood, and driven by impulses that no society law or moral code could restrain. As Peter Kürten moved into his late 20s, the world around him was changing rapidly. Germany entered a period of social upheaval and eventual war, and Peter's life intersected with these turbulent events in ways that would further shape the dark trajectory of his existence. Between 1910 and 1919, the combination of military service, imprisonment, and personal isolation contributed to the deepening of his sadistic tendencies, creating the foundations for the notorious crimes he would later commit as the Vampire of Düsseldorf. By 1910, Peter was already a seasoned criminal. His years of petty theft, assaults, arson, and sexualized aggression had honed his instincts, and he had become adept at evading authorities. Yet, despite his growing criminal skill, his life remained chaotic and unstable. Employment was irregular, relationships were brief and often exploitative, and his fascination with violence, blood, and control continued to intensify. At this stage, Peter began to demonstrate a chilling self-awareness of his own impulses. He understood that he was different, that his desire set him apart from ordinary men, and he embraced this difference rather than attempting to suppress it. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 provided a new environment for Peter's latent tendencies. Like many young German men, he was conscripted into military service. His time in the army was marked less by heroism and more by rebellion and desertion. Records indicate that he showed little respect for authority, flouting orders and exhibiting erratic behavior that unsettled his superiors. The brutality of war, with its widespread death and chaos, seemed to resonate with Peter rather than deter him. Surrounded by violence, he reportedly observed the suffering of fellow soldiers with a detached fascination. For a man already preoccupied with blood and pain, the battlefield became an extension of the twisted experiments he had carried out in civilian life. Peter's experiences during the war only amplified his fascination with death. Unlike soldiers who were traumatized or horrified by violence, he was increasingly drawn to it. The sight of injuries, the smell of blood, and the atmosphere of fear and chaos were, for him, sources of both fascination and gratification. These experiences further reinforced the psychological patterns he had developed in childhood and adolescence. The connection between suffering and control, the intoxicating allure of dominance, and the thrill of observing fear without empathy. His wartime behavior eventually led to legal consequences. Peter was repeatedly disciplined, and he ultimately deserted his post, an act that forced him into the criminal justice system once again. This period of imprisonment was particularly formative. Unlike brief stints as a young offender, his time in prison exposed him to hardened criminals, giving him insight into human depravity and survival strategies. Peter absorbed these lessons with remarkable attentiveness, learning not just how to manipulate guards and fellow inmates, but also how to hide the darker aspects of himself while plotting his next moves. Prison also offered him a strange sense of freedom within confinement. The monotony and rigidity of incarceration allowed Peter to indulge in mental experimentation, imagining scenarios of control, fear, and violence with an intensity that he could not experience outside the walls. These years became a kind of rehearsal space for his emerging criminal persona. He meticulously studied human behavior, plotting ways to inflict maximum psychological and physical suffering on future victims. In essence, prison became both a classroom and a laboratory for his dark ambitions. During these years, Peter's personal life remained fragmented. He had no meaningful attachments, no emotional anchors, and no moral guidance. His fascination with sexuality continued to intersect with his violent impulses, and he began to fantasize not only about physical domination but also about murder. These fantasies, initially abstract, became increasingly vivid, detailed, and methodical. He imagined scenarios in which he could exercise complete control over a victim's life and death, often focusing on blood as a symbol of both vitality and power. By the end of the war in 1918, Germany itself was in turmoil. Economic instability, political upheaval, and social unrest created a climate in which crime and violence flourished. For Peter, these conditions were ideal. He was already a man habituated to chaos, violence, and lawlessness. The disarray of post-war Germany provided both opportunity and cover for his impulses, while ordinary citizens struggled to survive. Peter's mind was preoccupied with increasingly elaborate fantasies of cruelty, laying the groundwork for the murders that would soon terrorize Dusseldorf. The years of war and imprisonment also had a profound psychological impact. Peter's empathy had all but disappeared. Experiences that might have shocked or restrained another individual only deepened his fascination with suffering. His fantasies, once private and speculative, were now ready to be tested in reality. Moreover, his capacity to manipulate others, honed during interactions with fellow prisoners, authorities, and soldiers, became a core feature of his emerging criminal identity. He was learning the art of deception, of blending into society while harboring intentions that were incomprehensible to those around him. By 1919, Peter Kürten had transformed from a reckless young adult into a calculating man, aware of his desires and methodically preparing for the acts that would define his infamy. He had survived poverty, abuse, failed relationships, war, and imprisonment. Each experience reinforced his obsession with control, domination, and blood. The man who would later be known as the Vampire of Düsseldorf was no longer just a criminal in training. He was a predator, equipped with both the psychological insight and the sadistic imagination that would allow him to commit some of the most notorious murders in German history. The period of 1910 to 1919 was, in many ways, the crucible in which Peter Kürten's monstrous persona was forged. The brutality of war, the harsh lessons of prison, and the unchecked growth of sadistic fantasies converged to create a man capable of extreme cruelty. By the end of the decade, he had fully embraced his identity as a manipulator and tormentor, ready to emerge from the shadows into the life of crime and murder that would make him infamous across Germany. Though the world would not yet witness the full scope of his violence, the foundation had been laid. Peter Kürten was a man who had survived hardship and transformed it into obsession. He had endured suffering and converted it into domination. The Vampire of Düsseldorf was ready to begin his reign, and the city would soon come to know fear in its most visceral, blood-soaked form. The end of World War I brought not peace, but a new environment of instability in Germany. Cities were struggling with economic hardship, political unrest, and a population traumatized by conflict. Into this fractured society returned Peter Kürten, now in his late 30s. Carrying with him the psychological scars of childhood abuse, teenage experimentation with cruelty, and the violent, formative experiences of war and imprisonment. He was no longer a reckless young adult. He was a man who had learned to conceal his obsessions and manipulate the world around him, carefully constructing the mask that would hide the darkness within. In 1920, Peter returned to Dusseldorf, the city where he would eventually commit the murders that earned him the infamous title of Vampire of Düsseldorf. On the surface, he attempted to lead a normal life. He took casual jobs, lived modestly, and even married, presenting to the world a semblance of stability and respectability. This period of his life, stretching through most of the 1920s, was characterized by an unsettling duality, the outward appearance of ordinariness, masking an inner life consumed by violent fantasies and sadistic desires. Peter's marriage, though outwardly conventional, was fraught with complexity. His wife would later play a pivotal role in his capture, but during these years, she provided the social cover he needed. Within the domestic setting, he maintained a facade of the devoted husband and worker, but the truth was far darker. Behind closed doors, Peter's mind remained preoccupied with fantasies of control, pain, and death. The marriage, in essence, served as a stage prop, enabling him to move freely in society without arousing suspicion. This period of apparent normalcy allowed Peter to hone one of his most dangerous skills, deception. He became a master of observation, learning to read the behaviors and routines of others. He studied the city, its inhabitants, and their patterns, noting the vulnerabilities that would later make his attacks so effective. His early crimes had taught him impulsiveness. Now he was learning patience, planning, and strategy. He understood that the key to prolonged criminal activity was not just violence, but concealment and manipulation. The 1920s also saw Peter experimenting with new methods to gratify his violent impulses while maintaining secrecy. He would occasionally attack women and children in ways that did not result in death, but allowed him to practice control and inflict fear. These assaults were carefully calculated, designed to avoid detection while satisfying his sadistic urges. The thrill of terror, the moment when a victim realized they were in danger, was intoxicating for him. He was not merely committing acts of violence, he was rehearsing the psychological aspects of domination that would later define his murders. During this period, Peter also continued his obsession with blood, a fixation that had persisted since adolescence. He occasionally cut himself or animals to study the flow, texture, and symbolism of blood. To him, blood represented both life and power. Controlling it, observing it, and eventually taking it from others became a core element of his fantasies. He began imagining scenarios in which he would directly draw blood from his victims, merging his sexualized fantasies with acts of physical domination. These thoughts were more than idle daydreams. They were rehearsals, mental exercises in anticipation of future crimes. Peter's ability to maintain this double life was remarkable. Neighbors and coworkers described him as polite, quiet, and unassuming. No one suspected the depth of his inner darkness. This mask of normalcy was not accidental, it was carefully constructed. He understood that to act on his desires without capture, he had to appear ordinary, even mundane. The dichotomy between his public persona and his private fantasies made him extremely difficult to detect. Setting the stage for the reign of terror he would unleash in the coming years. It was also during this period that Peter began to fully explore his sexual sadism. He discovered that fear and sexual arousal were inextricably linked in his mind. He would observe women and children, imagining scenarios in which he could exercise control over them, inflict pain, and derive pleasure. These fantasies were not fleeting. They were methodical, detailed, and increasingly violent. The city of Dusseldorf, teeming with unsuspecting residents, became a psychological playground where Peter's imagination could run free, preparing him for the acts that would later terrify the public. In addition to his psychological development, Peter's interactions with law enforcement during the 1920s were crucial. He remained aware of investigations into criminal activity, observing police procedures, and learning how to avoid capture. Early brushes with authorities reinforced his belief that he was cleverer than the system, that he could manipulate and outsmart those tasked with upholding the law. This confidence combined with his meticulous planning, would become a hallmark of his later crimes. By 1928, Peter Kürten had fully established himself in Dusseldorf as a man who appeared ordinary but harbored extraordinary darkness. He had mastered the ability to navigate society without detection while simultaneously rehearsing the psychological and physical components of violence. His fantasies had grown more elaborate, incorporating elements of sexual sadism, bloodletting, and psychological terror. The man who walked the streets of Dusseldorf during these years looked no different from any other citizen. But behind closed doors, the Vampire of Düsseldorf was taking shape, ready to step out of shadow into a world of fear and notoriety. The 8 years from 1920 to 1928 were, in many ways, a period of incubation. Peter was building the mask that would allow him to act on his darkest impulses without immediate consequence. The city itself, recovering from war and social instability, provided the perfect cover for his emerging predatory nature. He had learned patience, observation, and manipulation. He had refined his obsession with blood and domination. And most importantly, he had developed the psychological resilience necessary to commit acts that few could even imagine. By the end of the decade, Peter was no longer merely a fantasist or a minor criminal. He was a man who had rehearsed his identity, studied human behavior, and prepared the city itself as the stage for the horrors to come. The next chapter of his life, beginning in 1929, would mark the transition from imagination to reality, the first murders that would establish Peter Kürten as one of Germany's most notorious serial killers. The mask was complete, the predator was ready, and Dusseldorf would soon learn the meaning of fear at the hands of the vampire. By 1929, Peter Kürten had spent nearly 4 decades cultivating the dark impulses that would define his infamy. The years of childhood abuse, teenage cruelty, young adult crime, war, imprisonment, and careful societal observation had forged in him a man who could both blend into normal life and indulge in terrifying fantasies without detection. The city of Dusseldorf, largely unaware of the storm approaching, was about to encounter a predator whose actions would terrify a nation. This was the year when the Vampire of Düsseldorf truly awakened. Peter's first confirmed murders in 1929 marked a chilling escalation from his earlier criminal activities. His previous assaults, thefts, and arsons had been exercises in control and experimentation, but now he was testing the limits of human life itself. Unlike earlier crimes, these acts were deliberate, premeditated, and sadistically intimate. They were not random. They reflected a man fully aware of his desires and increasingly eager to bring his fantasies into reality. The earliest attacks were both methodical and terrifyingly personal. Peter began targeting women and children, selecting victims based on opportunity, isolation, and vulnerability. He sought control, not merely survival or material gain. The thrill came from instilling fear, observing panic, and ultimately experiencing the act of domination over life and death. His methods varied, including stabbing, strangulation, and in some cases, attacks that drew blood in a ritualistic manner. These early murders would later be recognized as the blueprint for his future crimes, precisely executed acts designed to terrorize and assert dominance. One of the most chilling aspects of this period was Peter's fixation on blood. Unlike many killers who view blood merely as a byproduct, Peter's relationship with it was ritualistic and obsessive. He would deliberately wound victims or manipulate situations to draw blood, often consuming small amounts himself. This act was both a literal and symbolic expression of power, reinforcing his self-perception as a predator who could dominate life itself. The moniker Vampire of Düsseldorf was rooted not just in media sensationalism, but in his very real bloodlust and obsession with the physical substance of life. During this period, Peter also demonstrated a disturbing psychological sophistication. He carefully planned his attacks to minimize risk, selecting times and locations where he was unlikely to be caught. He studied the routines of potential victims, monitored police activity, and adapted his methods as he learned from each act. While impulsivity had marked his teenage and young adult years, his murders in 1929 revealed a shift toward calculated, methodical violence. This combination of cunning and sadism made him exceptionally dangerous. The psychological terror he inflicted extended beyond the immediate physical harm. Peter took pleasure in the fear and confusion of his victims, observing their reactions, prolonging their suffering, and sometimes leaving them barely alive to experience the trauma of attack. These acts went beyond murder. They were exercises in psychological domination, designed to amplify his own gratification. In every detail, he demonstrated an understanding of human vulnerability that was both meticulous and deeply disturbing. By mid-1929, the city of Dusseldorf began to notice a pattern. Reports of brutal attacks on women and children circulated, and panic spread through the streets. Authorities were initially baffled. The crimes appeared random, the perpetrator elusive, and the methods unusually violent. Local media, sensing a gripping story, began to report on a mysterious assailant, though the full scale of Peter's crimes remained hidden. For the first time, the predator's actions were intersecting with public awareness, though few could imagine the depth of his depravity. Despite the growing attention, Peter was not reckless. He continued to maintain his outward appearance as a quiet, unassuming man. He worked, interacted with neighbors, and even attended social functions without arousing suspicion. This duality, normalcy in public, sadistic predator in private, was central to his success. It allowed him to operate under the radar, striking fear into the city while avoiding immediate detection. The mask he had built over the previous decade and a half was functioning perfectly. The first murders of 1929 were not only acts of physical violence, they were psychological statements. Peter was testing the limits of fear, control, and societal response. Each attack reinforced his identity as a predator and deepened his obsession with the interplay of life, death, and blood. He began to experiment with increasingly complex scenarios, combining elements of sexual sadism, physical assault, and bloodletting. These acts were rehearsals in terror, gradually escalating in severity and sophistication. Peter's victims during this period were carefully chosen for their vulnerability. Children, women, and individuals alone at night were most at risk. He avoided confrontations with men or groups, understanding that the thrill he sought required both dominance and minimal personal risk. This selectivity reflected a calculated mind, one capable of long-term planning and strategic execution. It was a hallmark of his predatory intelligence, an intelligence deployed in the service of terror. By the end of 1929, the Vampire of Düsseldorf had fully emerged. Peter Kürten had transitioned from fantasy and rehearsal to the reality of murder. His early crimes, once exploratory, were now systematic, sadistic, and lethal. He had discovered the intoxicating interplay of fear, domination, and blood, and he would not stop. The city, though beginning to feel unease, could not yet comprehend the scale or intensity of the violence that Peter had unleashed. The significance of this year lies not only in the murders themselves, but in the psychological transformation they represented. Peter had evolved from a man who imagined violence to one who enacted it with precision, enjoying every detail of the terror he created. The Vampire of Düsseldorf was no longer a theoretical predator lurking in shadow. He was a living, breathing nightmare, walking openly among the citizens of a city unprepared for the horrors to come. As the calendar turned from 1929 to 1930, the pattern of murder, bloodlust, and psychological domination would intensify. Peter Kürten had tasted the thrill of killing, and he was ready to escalate. The next phase of his criminal career would see a reign of terror that would grip Dusseldorf, challenge law enforcement, and cement his infamy in the annals of criminal history. The awakening of the vampire was complete. The city had been warned, yet it remained vulnerable, and Peter Kürten, the man who had spent decades preparing for this moment, was just getting started. By 1930, Dusseldorf had become the hunting ground of a predator whose methods were both brutal and cunning. Peter Kürten, now in his late 40s, had evolved from a man with violent fantasies into a murderer capable of calculated terror. The city, largely unaware of the true identity of the perpetrator, was gripped by fear. News of attacks, some fatal, spread quickly, and residents began to alter their routines, avoiding streets and alleys that had once been familiar and safe. The Vampire of Düsseldorf had entered his most prolific phase, a reign of terror defined by blood, psychological manipulation, and escalating violence. Kurten's methods during this period were increasingly diverse and sadistic. He combined stabbing, strangulation, and bludgeoning with acts designed to maximize fear. Often, victims were attacked in the privacy of their homes. Sometimes he struck in public spaces where the terror could ripple across a community. His obsession with blood remained central. He would wound victims to observe or taste the flow, blending sadistic gratification with ritualistic tendencies. For Peter, each act of violence was not merely a crime. It was an affirmation of power, a way to experience absolute control over life and death. The psychological component of his crimes became as important as the physical violence. Kürten understood the terror he inflicted went beyond wounds. The anticipation, the panic, the helplessness of victims. It was all part of the experience he orchestrated. In some cases, he would leave individuals alive, terrified and traumatized, as if to prolong his own satisfaction. The city itself became a canvas for his sadism, with fear spreading faster than any police investigation could contain. During this period, the media began to notice a pattern. Reports of a vampire-like assailant circulated, describing attacks characterized by unusual cruelty, bloodletting, and indiscriminate targeting of women and children. While the exact details were often sensationalized, the essence was true. Dusseldorf was under siege by a killer whose motives and methods were as horrifying as they were elusive. This coverage both heightened public fear and inadvertently reinforced Kurten's sense of power. He knew that the terror he created extended far beyond the immediate victims. Peter's ability to evade capture during this period was remarkable. He meticulously studied police responses, learned investigative methods, and adapted his attacks to minimize risk. Unlike impulsive criminals, he employed careful planning. He chose locations that offered escape routes, targeted isolated individuals, and varied his methods to confuse law enforcement. His cunning, combined with an intimate knowledge of the city and its residents, allowed him to continue his assaults while remaining invisible to authorities. Among the most chilling aspects of his reign of terror were the sexualized elements of his crimes. Kurten's assaults were not purely physical. They were entwined with a disturbing sexual component. His fantasies of domination, control, and blood were now enacted in reality, with victims often subjected to both physical assault and sexualized intimidation. These acts were meticulously planned, demonstrating not just sadism, but a perverse intelligence that allowed him to derive maximum psychological gratification. The terror extended beyond the immediate victims. Families, neighbors, and entire communities lived in heightened anxiety, aware that the attacks could strike anywhere at any time. Parents became hypervigilant, children were warned against strangers, and city streets that had once been ordinary became spaces of fear. In essence, Peter's crimes had a multiplier effect. Each assault or murder was a private act of sadism, but its impact reverberated through the wider population, amplifying the power he felt. During this period, Kurten also continued his experimentation with methods of murder and bloodletting. Each attack was an opportunity to refine his techniques, observe the limits of human fear, and explore new forms of sadistic gratification. Unlike typical criminals, who may repeat the same patterns, Peter constantly evolved. He learned from each encounter, adjusting his approach to maximize terror and control. This adaptability made him unpredictable and extraordinarily dangerous. Despite the increasing severity of his crimes, Peter maintained his public facade. To neighbors, co-workers, and casual acquaintances, he appeared as a quiet, polite, and unremarkable man. This dual existence, a socially acceptable exterior masking the inner predator, was a hallmark of his modus operandi. It allowed him to continue his reign of terror for months without arousing suspicion, demonstrating a chilling level of psychological sophistication. The city's authorities, frustrated and bewildered, intensified efforts to capture the perpetrator. Patrols increased, investigations were conducted, and residents were urged to remain vigilant. Yet, despite these measures, Peter remained elusive. He understood the limitations of law enforcement and exploited them, selecting victims and times that minimized risk while maximizing impact. The very fear that gripped the population became part of his power. The more terror spread, the more effective his reign became. By the end of yet the legacy of his actions continued to reverberate, providing lessons in criminal psychology and the dark potential of human nature. The execution of Peter Kürten on July 2, 1931, marked the official end of the Vampire of Düsseldorf. Yet it did not conclude the fascination and fear surrounding his life and crimes. In death, as in life, Kürten became a figure of grim notoriety, a case study in human depravity, psychological pathology, and the intersection of violence and obsession. His legacy would endure not only in the annals of criminal history, but also in the cultural imagination, inspiring both fear and scholarly analysis for decades to come. From the outset, the public's response to Kürten's execution reflected the extraordinary impact of his crimes. Citizens of Dusseldorf and beyond were captivated by the story of a man who had walked unnoticed among them, committing acts of extreme violence while maintaining a facade of normality. Newspapers recounted the details of his murders, the horror of his assaults, and the clinical precision with which he described his motivations. To many, Kurten embodied a nightmare made flesh, a reminder of the terrifying potential for evil hidden within ordinary appearances. Psychologists and criminologists quickly turned their attention to his life as a source of insight into the development of extreme criminal behavior. Peter Kürten's trajectory, from abused child to sadistic adolescent, from young adult criminal to orchestrated murderer, offered a rare and detailed record of the factors contributing to the emergence of a serial killer. Analysts highlighted key elements, including childhood trauma, early cruelty to animals, escalating sadistic impulses, sexualized aggression, and the interplay of societal neglect and personal pathology. His case became foundational in the study of criminal psychology, offering lessons on risk factors, behavioral patterns, and the early identification of dangerous tendencies. The enduring fascination with Kurten also stemmed from the meticulous and ritualized nature of his crimes. Unlike impulsive or opportunistic criminals, he had perfected the art of planning, observation, and psychological manipulation. His obsession with blood, the calculated selection of victims, and the combination of sexual and sadistic gratification distinguished him from ordinary offenders. Scholars noted that his methods revealed not only brutality, but also a sophisticated understanding of fear, demonstrating that true danger could emerge from intellect as much as from violence. Kürten's legacy also included the reflection of societal conditions that allowed him to operate for so long. Post-World War Düsseldorf, with its social instability, economic hardship, and fragmented communities, provided an environment in which a predator could thrive. The inadequacies of early 20th century policing, coupled with his ability to blend into society, extended his period of criminal activity. His life underscored the importance of social vigilance, law enforcement coordination, and psychological profiling in preventing similar tragedies. In popular culture, Peter Kürten became a symbol of the archetypal vampire, a creature whose obsession with blood transcended metaphor and became literal. Authors, filmmakers, and journalists invoked his name as the embodiment of terror, fascination, and human monstrosity. His life story inspired discussions about the limits of empathy, the nature of evil, and the ways in which fantasy and reality can intersect in the minds of the most dangerous individuals. The nickname Vampire of Düsseldorf ensured that his persona would endure in the collective consciousness, a chilling reminder of what can occur when violence and obsession converge unchecked. Peter Kürten's execution also marked a turning point in criminal justice and public awareness. The trial and media coverage revealed the importance of evidence-based investigation, survivor testimony, and psychological assessment. Law enforcement began to incorporate insights from his case into investigative practices, recognizing the necessity of profiling offenders who combine cunning, sadism, and psychological manipulation. The case served as a cautionary tale for cities and communities worldwide, demonstrating the consequences of neglecting both early warning signs and systematic investigative efforts. Moreover, Kürten's story highlighted the complexity of human evil. He was not a mindless killer. He was deliberate, intelligent, and sadistically aware of the effects of his actions. His ability to articulate his motives, plan his attacks, and manipulate both victims and authorities offered a window into a rare but profoundly dangerous psychological profile. For scholars and criminologists, his case underscored the interplay of nature and nurture, illustrating how childhood trauma, early behavioral disorders, and adult experiences can converge to produce extreme criminality. The cultural and psychological imprint of Peter Kürten extends beyond historical records. He continues to be studied in forensic psychology courses, cited in criminology research, and analyzed in discussions of serial killing as a behavioral phenomenon. His life story serves as both a warning and a tool for understanding the mechanisms of extreme violence, demonstrating how personality, opportunity, and social conditions can align to produce a predator of extraordinary danger. Even decades after his death, the memory of the Vampire of Düsseldorf evokes fear, fascination, and scholarly interest. His life story, marked by abuse, obsession, cruelty, and calculation, provides an enduring narrative of human darkness, while society ultimately prevailed in capturing and executing him. The lessons of Peter Kürten's life remain relevant: the importance of early intervention, the role of psychological understanding in criminal prevention, and the chilling potential of a mind that transforms fantasy into relentless reality. In the final analysis, Peter Kürten's infamy is not merely a record of violent acts, but a complex portrait of a man who embodied both cunning and cruelty. His legacy resides in the lessons learned, the societal awareness raised, and the continued study of criminal psychology he inspired. The city of Dusseldorf survived his reign of terror, yet the imprint of his actions remains indelible, a testament to the profound consequences of unchecked sadism and the enduring human fascination with the darkest aspects of the mind. The story of Peter Kürten, the Vampire of Dusseldorf, is a stark reminder of the fragility of social order in the face of human predation, the psychological depths of sadism, and the importance of vigilance, both societal and investigative. Though he met his end in 1931, the echoes of his life, crimes, and psychological legacy continue to reverberate, ensuring that the vampire is remembered, not as a myth, but as a chilling reality.